Trade, aid, immigration and security have been some of the main pillars of America's engagement with Africa. American presidents have a mixed record on the continent. The deadly 1993 Battle of Mogadishu was a tragic chapter for Bill Clinton. By his own admission, not stopping the 1994 Rwandan genocide was a major foreign policy failing. But in 2000, Clinton signed into law the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, to boost trade and investment on the continent. George W. Bush's foreign policy was unpopular around the world, but he did more than any other American president to combat AIDS in Africa under his presidential emergency plan for AIDS relief. Barack Obama's focus in Africa was trade, not aid, but America's intervention in Libya left that country deeply unstable. Obama said that was his biggest foreign policy regret. We've seen US President Donald Trump on the world stage, but we have not yet seen him in Africa. And today we look at the state of America's relationship with the continent. What are the Trump administration's priorities for Africa? Hello, I'm Haiti Adams Fitzpatrick.
And I'm Ayan Bior. Hadiza Kyari and Ariane Itagashaka are out today. But joining us is VOA senior White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara. We also have with us Maria Byrd. She's the Washington-based foreign correspondent for Nigeria's Channels Television. Ladies, hello and welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Nice to have you.
Well, the Trump administration recently unveiled a new initiative to strengthen America's economic ties with Africa. The plan is aimed at competing with China's growing influence on the continent. But more than 2.5 years into this administration, some foreign policy experts say Africa does not appear to be a priority for the US president. VOA's Jesusemen Oni has more.
Africa has a friend in the United States, according to a top diplomat.
America has an unwavering commitment to Africa.
But some foreign policy experts are questioning that commitment.
This president doesn't have the kind of personal connections with the continent. He's not interested in development in the way that President Bush was. He doesn't have many advisors who have a background in African politics, unlike the previous couple of presidents. And he hasn't done much engagement with Africans. Only 2 sub-Saharan African leaders have had Oval Office visits.
In December, the Trump administration outlined its strategy to counter China's influence in Africa.
The way in which the administration talked about China made it sound like Africans have no agency, that Africans are being hoodwinked.
But U.S. engagement with Africa should be based on mutual interest, says former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Johnny Carson.
It should be focused on building and strengthening our partnership, collaboration, and strength with African nations as partners, not as pawns.
The strategy is now being presented with fewer references to Beijing, and the administration shifting its focus to the private sector.
Africa is going to double the number of people between now and 2050. There's going to be millions and millions and millions of young Africans, and what they all will want is a job. If they don't get a job, the continent will be unstable. It will open it up to vulnerability from violent extremism. Millions of Africans will try to migrate to Europe.
The Trump administration in June launched the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, which increases funding for U.S. investment in low and middle income countries, and Prosper Africa, which aims to remove hurdles preventing U.S. companies from pursuing commercial opportunities in Africa. Yet some analysts say that's still not enough.
The administration has been slow to react in dealing with some of the major issues confronting Africa today, both issues related to security and political instability.
First Lady Melania Trump and First Daughter Ivanka have made separate trips to Africa, but President Trump has yet to visit the continent. Jesusemen Oni, VOA News, Washington.
You know, sometimes it seems like you have to look extremely hard to really find out what this administration's Africa policy is about. I'm not saying there is no strategy, it's just very hard to know what exactly it is. For someone who has to report on this, Patsy, how do you convey this information to an audience so that people are able to digest this and really understand what the Trump administration's priorities are on the continent?
Well, we do it the way we cover any other story, right? We find out what the policy is and then what's the debate behind the policy, and then we try to come up with some sort of way to make it engaging to our audience. So for the case of Africa, yes, you're right, there's very little in terms of the administration's policy on Africa. The first time it was released, it was in December 2018. That's almost a full 2 years after Donald Trump was inaugurated. So there's been very little on that, and then there's very little development since that. But also, just to make the point that this administration doesn't put a lot of emphasis, doesn't give a lot of attention to countries unless it has a conflict with. Right now, it's about North Korea, it's about Iran, it's about places where there's tension, for example, China trade. But there's very little attention on Indonesia, for example. There's very little attention on other Southeast Asian countries. So it's not necessarily a lack of attention to Africa. Yes, there is a lack of attention of Africa, but just a lack of attention of any other region in the world in which the administration doesn't have a conflict with.
And that doesn't seem strategic.
Yes.
Yeah. As journalists, I feel like we are uniquely positioned not only to speak to the world, but to also hear from the world. And I can tell you from my experience reporting, when I hear from young people from the continent, I hear a lot of young people reject the notion that Africa and our countries are charity cases. This idea that we are dependent on aid, I think, is something that a lot of young people have really fought against. And I think it's very emblematic when you think of coltan and tantalum. 80% of coltan is found on the continent in Africa. Without these two minerals, our phones would not work. And I think that's emblematic of how young Africans see the continent. We see ourselves as partners in business, in entrepreneurship, et cetera, et cetera. From both of you, what are your audiences telling you? What is your audience on the continent telling you about how they perceive themselves and how the media perceives them?
I definitely think that Africans, especially millennials, perceive themselves in a position of entrepreneurship. They see themselves in the ability to kind of, if you think about it, they say 1 in 4 people will be of African descent. And so we know that Africa is continuing to grow, that there's continued opportunity there. So I think many, even those who have come to the States or gone to London to go to school, are going back to Africa because of the opportunity that exists there. And as you've mentioned, they're in a much better space to be able to grow. I mean, the infrastructure in the U.S. is failing in some ways. And in Africa, you don't have all of those wires hanging in. And as you mentioned, mobile devices are being used today in a way that I think even in the U.S. we can't imagine. And Africa is prime to be able to take that forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think from the administration's point of view, the positioning that the lens to which we look at Africa, not just in terms of aid, but also trade, that's not a new thing. That's something that's been happening for the past 10, maybe even 15 years. And that's something that the Trump administration continues to focus on. However, it's not just about investment, and in particular, not just about investment in terms of blocking China and the Belt and Road Initiative and trying to offer what the American alternative is, but there's also issues of counterterrorism, there's issues of security, there's issues of stability, and those are the things that are not being looked at, particularly by the Trump administration. There's no robust strategy in that sense.
Is there a real worry behind the scenes or from what you're hearing about China? Are they concerned about China in Africa, beyond the trade war between the US and China? Are they worried?
The agreement or the consensus in Washington is that people, senators, congressmen, administration officials, they went to Africa and then they saw that essentially, and this is somebody in the administration telling me, that China's eating their lunch. So they are seeing, for example, in Malawi, the airport has Chinese characters, right? For example, in many places, they just see even in Papua New Guinea, where I know this is not in Africa, but the vice president went there and traveled on a road built by Chinese money and red flags everywhere. These kinds of things get to the Trump administration, and they're trying to overcome that by offering this alternative investment, which may not be something attractive to Africans.
But there is an America First policy, which I think has garnered mixed reactions all over the world. I mean, how does the White House push that agenda of America First while at the same time looking at Africa and trying to have these different business partnerships to try to beat out Russia or even China?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, America first is whatever that they are offering will be of something of interest to the U.S., right? Any kind of investment will be for the benefit of American businesses and American companies. And frankly, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to tell African countries that don't take Chinese money because of human rights abuses or environmental abuses. But then the question is, what is the alternative that the White House is offering? And right now, it's $60 billion in this form of the DFC, which is double what it was before, but it hasn't been rolled out yet. So there's not actually any loans or grants available yet.
I have a very quick question for you, Maria. You work very closely with the Congressional Black Caucus. This kind of America seeming to be retreating in general on the global stage, but particularly in Africa doesn't seem to have that much, Africa doesn't seem to be such a big priority. What are they saying, and what's the sense you get from them?
So the Congressional Black Caucus is very committed to Africa. They have been for many years. And so what they're really looking at is ways to be able to assist, but not assist from an aid perspective, assist in the way of developing jobs, looking for the U.S. to go in and not necessarily to get jobs, but to go in and to help train and to help to really cultivate a culture that will allow those who are in Africa and the Africans to be able to build their own companies and to be able to really look at trade in a different way rather than kind of the U.S. offering something, but looking at how Africa has a lot to offer to the rest of the world.
And we'll talk about this a little later on in the show. Ladies, what do you think America's priorities should be in Africa? You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle there is @VOA Our Voices. You can also use the hashtag VOA Our Voices. And you can message us on WhatsApp. That number is right there on your screen.
You might have noticed there's never a dull moment at the White House. So what's it like to work there? We'll take you inside after the break. Before we go there, though, we asked some of our other reporters here at VOA how they cover America's foreign policy. Here's what they had to say.
I cover technology news out of California, and it's been very interesting. There's a lot of Africans in Silicon Valley. There's a lot of Silicon Valley companies that are very interested in Africa. People want to know what Africans think about technology, what do they need, and Africans in Silicon Valley are working on technology technology to be used around the world, not just Africa.
It was on March 13, 2018. A few reporters, including me, just returned from Africa to Washington, D.C. We had traveled with the then Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, to 5 African countries: Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, Chad, and Nigeria in about a week. Then a tweet had changed everything. Tillerson was out. Mike Pompeo was appointed as the new Secretary of State. My job is to report the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I try to tell audience unfiltered news as a matter of fact, the best I can.
U.S. foreign policy has ripple effects across the world, and I personally cover Africa. First, we take a look at what happens here in Washington, D.C. A lot of policymakers discuss specific issues about places where there's a lot of conflict, issues that affect foreign aid, issues that affect business relationship with private companies or other entrepreneurs, tech industry. So U.S.'s relationship with Africa. But also we reach out to African government officials to see what the discussion looked like so that we can have a balanced view of what these foreign policy decisions are. But we take it a little bit further here at VOA. And we have stringers all across the continent that we reach out to see how these foreign policy decisions are directly impacting people on the ground.
Welcome back. Ask any journalist covering the White House and they'll tell you any given day can range from interesting to intense, to say the least. VOA's Patsy Widakuswara has a front row seat to all of it. She's one of dozens of U.S. and international White House correspondents. So we followed her to her work recently. And here's what a day in her life looks like.
I usually get in by around 9 o'clock. Okay, welcome to our glamorous closet. This is our booth, our spaceship as we call it. I share it with my colleague Steve Herman. Here, all our gear is here. I have a handy dandy system here in my spaceship. As soon as I wake up, I think I look at how my day will be defined by the president's tweets. That's the first thing that I check in the morning. Usually my chance to speak to the president is when I'm pool reporter, all the pool reporters at the Oval Office, and we ask him questions. The other opportunity would be when he leaves on Marine One. And you know, you have the sound of the helicopter in the background and you're screaming at the president, hoping that he will take your question. If the president doesn't like your question, he can just say, I can't hear you, and move on to the next one. And then the other part of my day, of course, is just speaking to administration officials and experts outside of the White House when I'm working on a story. Mostly I focus on television production. Analysts argue that his trade war with China is causing uncertainty in the world markets. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News at the White House. So I'm trying to get back on track here. I just came back from a trip with President Trump where there was a lot of cheese. What is this? This may be the leaker, the White House leaker. We found him. Because this is such a small room and it's in the basement, I actually have to come up for air every couple of hours or so. Coffee break. So that's our seat, and that's one of 49 seats here at the James Brady briefing room, which, as you can see, doesn't really get used a lot anymore. It's kind of like a storage room situation now, since we hardly ever get any press briefings. I juggle motherhood with my career by having allies, asking for support when I need it, being focused on what you're doing then. You know, if I'm with my son, I can't be thinking about my job, and vice versa. When I'm on my job, I can't be thinking about my son too much. Is Brazil accepting any of the G7 offer for aid? Under what capacity is Mr. Eduardo Bolsonaro here? You wanna get in? Let's go. Having focus and mindfulness on what I'm doing at that time makes me feel like I'm more stress-free in whatever it is that I'm doing. You definitely need comfortable shoes, but I usually just ignore that rule because I don't want to look hot. Considering that the president communicates through Twitter, even though there's a lid, even though we leave the White House, we're kind of always glued to our phone and just monitoring what news might break after that.
Wow, well, Patsy, you make it look so easy. Looks like, but you know, journalism
I just wing it.
Well, but journalism is such an intense job. But I'm wondering, take us back, why did you decide to become a journalist, and how did you make your dreams come true?
Well, I started working in radio when I was in college. And then while in college, I started a debating society, which is the first debating society in Indonesia. And because of debating, one of the judges, she saw me, and then when she started a television station in Indonesia, she said, would you come and audition? And that's when I started in broadcast and in television. I did take 1 year off. So I've been a journalist all my life. I took 1 year off just to ask myself, do I want to be a journalist or do I want to make money?
You came back for more.
Yes, that moment we need to decide that. And so I like not making money. Yeah.
So, Maria, your job is essentially to answer all the questions that the African media has. And I'm just going to assume here that your job involves a lot of running around. You cover just about everything here in Washington, D.C. But what are the main questions that you get from the African media about what America and who America is today?
Well, one of the things that I think we can all kind of sit easy on is that people are still interested, very much interested in what's happening in Washington. Regardless of the administration, they very much want to know what is happening with our president, what is happening with our Congress, what do our policies mean for the rest of the world. We sometimes take for granted how much our policies actually impact the rest of the world. Where are we going? What's happening in the Middle East? That's a common question I get. The immigration issue has been one that they're very interested in understanding, what is the issue with the border? Why does a wall need to go up? Why are people sitting there and detaining in centers and being detained? Why are people dying on the border trying to get to the U.S.? Why is this now becoming a real issue? Another piece that's becoming a big question in Africa is, are African Americans and people of color safe? And that is a real issue for them because they often hear whether it's being killed by police, whether or not it's any type of racial issues that exist in the U.S. They feel like there's kind of been an increase in that, and they want to know what's happening and why are we seeing this, especially since we're so many years removed from what many would consider the civil rights movement. Right. And so they want to ask questions about the Black Lives Movement. I mean, there's just so much.
Because when they come to the United States and when Africans emigrate here, they have to take on the race issues themselves. They also have to absorb what it's like to be black in America.
Yeah.
Correct.
But has the image of America changed, in recent years, just based on the conversations that the both of you have had, with your audiences? I'm just wondering, you mentioned police shooting, and there's, just a lot in the news lately. I'm wondering if that has affected how America is seen, outside of America.
I would say that in some ways, especially in Africa and Nigeria, I'll be quick on this, is that they see the administration and then they see America in some ways. I think they put a separation on the two. And will that continue? I don't know. I didn't see as much of that when I was covering the Obama administration, but you do see, what are Americans saying and then what is the administration saying?
So one of the things that President Trump does say is, the term the fake news media. And I'm wondering, is it hard for the both of you to do your jobs, under this climate? There's attacks on journalists, and there's just less media freedoms globally, around the world. How do you as journalists approach that?
So for me personally, the way it affects me, it just makes me want to triple check and quadruple check my work. Because if you're going to accuse me of fake news, you have to be able to point out which part of my work is not telling the truth. But there is a really contentious relationship between the White House and the press corps. I mean, there's always a situation where when the president wants to brief us, the helicopter is in the background. We're jostling and trying to kill each other with our ladders and our cameras. It's very unsafe, and it's psychologically also putting us at a level below the president, because we're shouting and we're begging for crumbs. It's not orderly. So it's a very...
Is it Mortal Kombat every day?
It is exactly Mortal Kombat every day.
Maria, I want to bring you into this conversation. Marty, Byrd, the editor of the Washington Post, said journalists are not at war, they are at work. Do you agree with that?
I think that they are definitely at work. I mean, I think that today it's really about the facts, as Patsy has said. I think that you really are looking to see what are the facts. Did I get the correct information? Did I report the correct information? And just being clear with the audience, because I do think that it's all about perception. And in today's economy and in the way we're looking at, especially in Africa, you're seeing a separation about age. Many people that might have been more accomplished, more fluent, might have, as you said, looking at Trump as he's giving the reality. Money is power and money becomes a huge issue. But some of the younger individuals are looking for something else and looking for something different. And so they are questioning a little bit more. And so I think it's really about just knowing what you're there to deliver and doing the job.
And do you think people are going, this election cycle coming up from your audiences, not just in Africa but around the world, do you think this is going to be one election cycle where the rest of the world will really, really pay attention, perhaps more than they have in the past?
I've been doing the election cycle now for the last 2 to 3 months, so I definitely think that they are looking to see, especially when you see such a stark difference between the Republican and Democratic parties.
And it's always interesting to our viewers around the world just to see how American democracy works and how what we call democracy is actually undemocratic by other countries' standards. It's not a one-man, one vote, for example. The Electoral College the election cycle is an opportunity to explain all of that to our viewers, and the fact that America, the beacon of democracy, is actually quite undemocratic in some ways.
And, you know, I'm not going to go into who said it, but it has been said that, you know, the presidency doesn't define who you are, but it reveals who you are. And I think definitely this administration and sort of the atmosphere in America right now, this doesn't define America, but I do feel that it reveals who America is. And there's still lots more, and we're all going to stay tuned. And this has been fantastic. Thank you so much, ladies, for your insights. After the break, we're going to introduce you to a woman blazing a diplomatic trail in the world of media and foreign policy. We'll be back in a moment.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
Welcome back. Today we're highlighting extraordinary achievements of women working in foreign policy. We call them our Women to Watch.
Well, this week we've got our eye on Bunmi Akinosotu. She's the voice behind the podcast What in the World? And her show promotes US foreign policy and gives an international platform to experts from underrepresented groups and communities. Bunmi attributes her passion for foreign policy to her roots. She's a first-generation Nigerian American. She was a political appointee at the Environmental Protection Agency during the Obama administration, and that's where she worked hard on initiatives for global resource conservation policy, civil rights and tribal partnerships. Bunmi hopes to be the first US Nigerian American ambassador.
Well, if you think there's someone extraordinary we should feature as our woman to watch, use the hashtag VOA Our Voices and tell us about her. Visit VOA's website to find the latest news from around the world. You can also catch up on previous episodes of Our Voices. Today, we leave you with a quote from former U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, who used her voice to say, "Foreign policy simply cannot be judged by today's headlines that chalk up victories and defeats like so many box scores in the sports sections."
And that is our show this week. A very special thank you to our guests, VOA senior White House correspondent Patsy Widakuswara and Washington correspondent for Nigeria's Channels Television, Maria Byrd. Thank you, ladies. It was great to have you here.
Thank
we hope
you.
to have you back on the show soon again.
Thank you.
And we do want to thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Until then, it's goodbye.